I am Games, and I hereby solemnly swear to review every GameCube game over the next 35 years. Luigi's Mansion was a launch title for the GameCube down to its bones, continuing a tradition the company has of building their launch titles in tandem with the console itself, letting their development shape one another. Luigi's Mansion caused the expansion of the head on the controller's C-stick and the inclusion of dynamic lighting into the console's graphical abilities, while the game's control scheme was gradually altered into something which would be simpler to play with the layout the controller eventually settled on. Originally, Luigi's Mansion was being developed with Mario as the protagonist, which doesn't seem too weird when you consider how he'd receive his own backpack apparatus not long afterwards, but he was swapped out with his brother because the team wanted a more cowardly character in the leading role, or so they say, though it's equally likely that they knew gamers would more readily accept a game so different from the traditional Mario formula as a console launch title from the franchise if it didn't star Mario himself. Whatever the case, they stuck Luigi in his first legitimate leading role and finally nailed down his first ever significant character trait, being a total goddamn scaredy cat. Consider that the Mario launch title for the Nintendo 64 was Super Mario 64, one of the most legendary video games ever made, and a lengthy, fully featured 3D platformer adventure. Right from the start, Nintendo had pushed the idea of a game about jumping in a 3D environment about as far as their imaginations could take it. What the GameCube offered by comparison, besides a graphical step up, was simply an increase in the specificity of what could be accomplished in that 3D space. More precise controls and aiming, better camera movement, and generally greater clarity of what's going on were the GameCube's strongest selling points. I am willing to believe that Nintendo flat out didn't think there was any need to upgrade the graphical capabilities of their consoles beyond this point, since doing so would no longer significantly expand on what the player was actually able to do in a game, which is why they got into the business of motion controls and touchpads in the coming generations. But when they arrived in a future wherein gamers were getting used to higher and higher standards of photorealistic graphics, they inevitably had to step up their game. While Mario 64 would eventually receive a proper sequel in the form of Super Mario Sunshine, which pushes the GameCube's apparent capabilities a lot farther than Luigi's Mansion, it's easy to see how this game was meant to take advantage of the step up in hardware. The central gimmick of sucking up ghosts is a frenetic looking frenzy of animations, as players manage relatively precise if also slow and forgiving line of sight control with their vacuum, while terrified ghosts scramble to escape from the airflow, jerking the player all over the place. When you get a hold of several at once and try to lasso them all in from different directions, it's hard not to think that no other game had pulled off anything this visually impressive on a home console yet. Weirdly, Luigi's Mansion's control scheme is both its main draw and its worst problem. Stunning a ghost with your flashlight and then sucking them up with the vacuum is massively satisfying when you pull it off in one fell swoop, or when you're dragging a ghost like it's a fish from the Ocarina of Time minigame and convincingly mirroring its movements in order to suck it in. Tracing after a ghost with your flashlight is meanwhile frustrating, because the camera is set at angles which make it awkward to determine the exact spatial relationship between Luigi and his surroundings. A top-down approach would have made the vertical height of enemies unclear, and a flat horizontal approach would have done the same for the gamer's depth perception, but since the most conducive method to twin-stick aiming in a three-dimensional space is a first-person viewpoint, there really is no other perfectly satisfying angle to judge these relationships, and the ones which the game inconsistently swaps between never give you the opportunity to really get used to the sluggish C-stick aiming with Y-axis inversion that you can't disable in time for a first playthrough. When you really pare it down to the core mechanics and look at what you have to do to beat the game, Luigi's Mansion is shockingly arcadey for a Nintendo game from 2001. If you know where everything is, you can easily make a beeline through the mansion, skipping all the optional content and blasting through bosses if you've mastered the controls. It's a game you could speedrun in under 4 hours just naturally on a second playthrough if you paid attention to your first go-through, and the world record is just over an hour for a 100% run. It's a completely linear game, a solved one, insofar as there is an easily detectable most correct order of operations, with the hardest variables being holding on to the ghosts all the way to the end, and frankly this doesn't seem to always be possible. I would assume that there is some kind of RNG being rolled against the timing and distance of your vacuum blast, since the pro strat seems to be continually pressing the trigger over and over again, but ghosts will still escape from the stranglehold, most likely a deliberate choice on Nintendo's part to keep the ghost battles consistently fresh and exciting, though at high level play I can imagine this becomes infuriating in how it makes runtime times unpredictable. This is not to say that I want to accost Luigi's Mansion for failing to be as satisfyingly endlessly replayable as it could possibly be. In fact, I really do think that shaking up the ghost encounters with some unpredictability does enhance the freneticism of a first-time playthrough in a welcome enough way that, with the reasonable expectation that most players aren't going to play this game over and over again, it could be justified. Having said that, if you had a GameCube at launch and didn't find Super Monkey Ball or Waverace Blue Storm to your taste, you might have had to do that in the near goddamn month you waited for Pikmin in Japan or 2 weeks in North America, which is likely why the game's brevity was so often brought up negatively in its reviews, in spite of the fact that the critical darling of that year, Devil May Cry, was only 2 to 5 hours long at most. Luigi's Mansion's problem isn't being short, but being padded out in spite of its brevity anyways. As mentioned previously, the game is pretty much linear, but it doesn't present itself that way. It encourages exploration and constant tinkering, testing the mechanics against the environment and memorizing the layout of the mansion in its entirety instead of simply solving the puzzle of whatever you have to do next. As the game goes along, your two main goals are to collect the ghosts inhabiting many of the mansion's rooms, usually receiving keys to new rooms upon doing so, and also to collect the regular boos which are left in the rooms sometimes after they've been cleared. The most efficient way to accomplish everything would be to enter each room, clear its challenge, collect the treasure from whichever furniture you know to contain it, and then locate and capture the boo immediately. However, because the boos will often fly through the walls into rooms which you don't yet have the keys to, you will most likely go back to trying to progress through the main plot before you continue your attempt at that boo, thus necessitating backtracking later, even though you could have simply reset the boo encounter until you were able to catch it before it leaves. There are moments when Luigi's Mansion offers some player choice by leaving access to several ghost challenges available at once, some of which are completely optional, alongside the ability to go back through the places you've been to figure out what you might have missed. If you've already played through the game, then you'll know that it never presents you with a challenge that you can't tackle immediately, but if you're unsure about whether or not you can actually beat certain ghosts before unlocking another power-up, then you might give up on them and go off to find something else to do. Obnoxiously, the game restarts you at the entrance of the mansion when you die, instead of at the last toad which you spoke to save your game. Anything which you've accomplished before your last save will be preserved, but you'll find yourself at the front door, needing to run all the way back to wherever you were and possibly sit through up to a minute of unskippable cutscene. This started to feel egregious on something like the third boss, which requires quite a trek from the entrance to reach, including a part where you've got to run all the way around the backyard of the house because you don't have the key to this shortcut door. As it turns out, you can get this key by running on a treadmill in the weight room, and I just never found it on my first playthrough. Had I been playing diligently, I would have tested every one of Luigi's possible interactions with every single object in the mansion, but since I wasn't, and since I just assumed that I simply hadn't been given the key yet and would eventually, since it's not like there's any other instance of a key being obtained this way, I never got access to the shortcut, which would have cut a good 30 seconds or more off of my repeated travel time, though still not enough to make me think that there was a real reason for spawning at the entrance as opposed to spawning at a toad. For that matter, it's also kind of a surprise that talking to the toads doesn't restore your health, nor are there commonly health drops after beating individual ghosts. The only time your health is fully restored is after beating each of the first 3 of the game's 4 major bosses, so you're basically in a gauntlet of about 6 ghosts and a boss in each section unless you go on a health run. You will eventually unlock areas where you can guarantee a full health restore, but they're a little out of the way, and if you've got something like 45 health, then you'll probably have to be killed a couple of times before you're convinced that you should go hunt for healing items, even though dying doesn't automatically restore any health from after the last time you saved. I can appreciate the idea that since the ghost battles individually are rarely difficult, they didn't want you to be able to make it through a whole section of game without ever being in danger, but having to go hunt down places with big hearts, resave, and then head back to where you died is a pain in the ass, and making a pilgrimage to a toad for a heal and a save would already do enough to convey the sense of the game being challenging, since you needed to go out of your way to heal, and you wouldn't have to either roll the dice on the RNG of objects which can sometimes yield small hearts, or memorize the few places where you can find big ones. Having said that, it's not as though knowing these spots where the big hearts lie isn't memorable in its own right, and maybe even invited by more patient gamers than I. Before I begin to come off harsh on this game that I do like, let us acknowledge how it has succeeded and been remembered enough to earn a 3DS sequel. Luigi's Mansion nailed the cartoony haunted house aesthetic like no other game before it, coming straight from the Scooby-Doo school of cutesy spooks. It's obvious that the game's use of ghosts as a motif had more to do with trying to justify their mechanics with something pop culturally comprehensible that they could have a Mario character do than it did with what the ghosts suggest thematically in themselves, hence the tone of the game is not really scary, but evokes a feeling of playfulness within the space of what a haunted house story is. If the game seemed to be trying to scare the player and failing, it would come off as annoying, but by characterizing Luigi as a coward who shakes in his boots and whistles the excellent theme song to keep himself comfortable, we can accept the mechanic of him getting stunned by sudden ghost appearances even if we could see it coming. Most of the dialogue is jokey and lighthearted, and would-be shocking moments are comically subverted. The game even ends on a slapstick gag with Mario that finally takes Luigi's tension away with laughter. Nintendo games have long exhibited some of the strongest visual presentations in gaming, especially when their games are zeroed in on a particular theme, and Luigi's Mansion is the cream of the company's crop. At the time the game came out, I remember thinking it practically looked like real life as a kid stepping up from the N64, but like most GameCube games, its visuals have held up because of their clarity rather than density of detail. Many attempts at photorealism from this era on other consoles now look like a blurry mess of textures, while Nintendo's colored 3D models from this game are instantly recognizable. The mansion itself really does stick in your mind, and you'll know your way around it pretty confidently by the end, having felt as if the team pushed the idea of what could be done in this space about as far as they reasonably could without getting a bit esoteric. The central control gimmick and the extent of the setting's creative allowances leave us with a game that basically explored everything interesting it could do in the span of just a few hours, and was structured to lightly obfuscate this while admitting to the limitations of what the controls could actually deliver on well. Aiming with the C-stick ended up being enough of a pain that they included a movement mode in which Luigi can be controlled entirely with just the left thumbstick, and you'll quickly find yourself developing tech such as whipping around in a quick circle when you want to stun a ghost, because it's way faster than trying to turn with the stick. Once you acquire elemental powers, you will realize that when using them on enemies, they will lose 5 health points so long as you touch them with the element at all, and continuously blowing it from your hose will deplete the meter too fast for certain encounters, so your best strategy is to just repeatedly tap the blow button every few seconds. I can imagine that the game was designed this way with the expectation that most players would not be able to maintain a continuous stun lock on enemies, though this is pretty easy to do and results in losing the encounter because you were too good about pinning down the enemy instead of learning exactly how much elemental power you were going to need for that encounter. Capturing all of the game's central 23 ghosts is fun when the rules of each encounter vary somewhat, and certain battles are unexpected shakeups, while the rooms where you battle a large number of small ghosts present a more traditionally arcadey reflexive challenge in enemy crowd management. On top of winning these fights, you'll need to catch a considerable number of the boos, even though collecting every single one is presented as optional and only necessary for getting the highest possible ending grade. Whereas fighting regular ghosts is a matter of aiming your flashlight at and stunning them, and then instantly hammering the right trigger and fishing them up, the boos can't be paralyzed, and so you have to aim the vacuum itself at them. And while it still locks on when you get it right, the boos have a much easier time of breaking out from your grip than the other ghosts, even though they move less. Catching boos ultimately ends up being a pain in the ass because of their ability to jump through walls. Even once you've unlocked all of the rooms in the mansion, when you're trying to catch some of the later ghosts, if you can't manage to maintain perfect traction on them, then you'll be running back and forth through doors after them, which isn't an interesting challenge really in any way and gets old very quickly. So the prospect of going through with it seems less inviting than it would be to simply play through the game normally unless you really love this gameplay. Luigi's Mansion is a solid game with a memorable central control gimmick and aesthetic, which doesn't overstay its welcome or overcomplicate its gameplay beyond some minor shakeups in the name of lengthening it out a little for first-time players. Too many moments in the game feel cheap, such as when the final boss drops on you while you're trying to pick up the bombs you can hurt him with before they explode, and too much of it is randomly driven to be without occasional frustration, but not enough to stop a first playthrough from being overall enjoyable, and the chaff that you can excise if you want to play it again makes the occasional run-through worthwhile on the idea that you could play it better this time, though not likely on the level that you'd find yourself returning to the arcade-style games of companies like Treasure or Platinum. Luigi's Mansion gets a 12 out of 16 on the GameCube Forever scale. It's definitely worth playing for anyone with an interest in the GameCube library or who resonates with the game's aesthetic and mechanical ideas. It's not likely going to blow your mind in 2018, and even in its time it was a modest exploration in compared to what Nintendo was going to bring to the console later, possibly opening the door for similar experiments in short and fairly simple games based on unique mechanics such as the Wii U's Captain Toad's Treasure Tracker. Nevertheless, its frustrations are fleeting and forgivable, and it's well worth the single afternoon of your time it'll take to beat. Monkey Ball is such an obviously good idea that it surely must have been thought of long before the technology existed to design it competently. Strictly speaking, it's a game about rolling a ball around until it passes through a goal, by way of controlling the stage itself. That is to say that the head of the control stick metaphorically is the map, and you move it around to subtly adjust the momentum of the ball. You could think of this as being like one of those wooden puzzle boxes where you try to guide a marble into a hole, except that while those games are limited to your own fixed perspective, this one follows the perspective of the ball itself. There's nothing else to the game. It controls entirely with a single stick, yet what the precision of these mechanics and the incredible variety of subtle differences in potential win and fail conditions with courses built around exacerbating them allow for is a game with nearly unlimited potential. Sega's Amusement Vision went straight for the throat, skipping all of the chaff and crafting the most intense set of challenges they could imagine to push the mechanics to the limit. Make no mistake, this is a proper old school balls hard Sega arcade game, even though it came out in 2000 and was marketed for families. We'll get into how the GameCube port allowed that to make even a lick of sense, but even in that version, trying to beat the main game in its entirety is not the kind of thing you're gonna knock out in a couple of days, unless that's something you could also do with Dragon Force and Guitar Hero. Beginner mode is 10 minutes of satisfying fun as you develop a grasp on the controls, but unless you're particularly awful, it's unlikely to take you more than 10 to 15 minutes to complete even on a first try. You're given 15 lives between 5 continues to finish 10 levels in a row, and in the event you actually lose all of those, you can head over to practice mode and try any of the levels you've been to as many times as you like. After completion, you're forced to play a painfully long and obnoxious credit sequence, surely designed to make sure that the little kids who got this game from their parents had a chance to experience the feeling of having beaten arcade mode before running off with their tail between their legs to the party games, because not a lot of them are getting through the 30 advanced levels. I certainly couldn't after hours of attempts over several days, and I think I maybe saw level 6 of the 50 stage expert mode. I have to respect that Sega stuck to their guns on keeping the main game tight, with what I could reasonably proclaim was the most gratifying experience that a dedicated player could have possibly had with these mechanics. They even had the balls to dare little kids to at least throw themselves up against these levels for a few more hours than they might have just to unlock the mini games. I don't know how coordinated the design and marketing of this game was, but I'm struck by the audacity of the box to advertise itself as a party game with 6 different ways to play, most prominently monkey, billiards, bowling, and golf, and then to individually paywall each of these behind a couple hours worth of player points, which you can only earn through single-player arcade mode. It's not insultingly cruel. Even a kid would notice that you keep the play points you make from clearing each level even when you don't beat the entire gauntlet, so it's just as worth your time to fruitlessly throw yourself at trying to get past the advanced levels as it would be to play beginner mode again. Ergo, even little kids will most likely eventually experience getting at least slightly better at the game on their way to unlocking all of the minigames, and thus might be tempted into dedicating themselves to total mastery, while older players, enchanted by the game's unique controls and brutal escalation of challenge, might put it into their rotation just from seeing what the later levels entail. Because Monkey Ball gets completely goddamn insane if you actually master the 30 minutes of straight punishment that is expert mode on a single continue. In the original arcade game, this led to another 9 extra levels tacked onto the end of the round, ending with the painstaking master stage. On the GameCube version, if you 1cc the extra stages, there's an entire 10 tracks of master stages ahead of you that take the game's aesthetic to its most glorious and rewarding extreme. While we're on the subject of design, we have to address Monkeyballs Marketing. If you imagine a version of Monkey Ball that didn't have the monkeys inside the balls, it would be difficult to tell exactly which direction your ball's momentum was currently facing. While the camera doesn't usually lag too far behind your movement, part of the game's challenge is that it takes some time for the direction of your ball's momentum to shift, so you can't always just simply make a quick movement without a whole lot of room or a really solid grasp of what you're doing, because your ball will fly all over the place. The obvious solution here would be something like a magnetic compass tracking the direction of your momentum as the camera's north, and that's exactly what the monkey was created as a fun and culturally recognizable idea to represent. When you've got a puzzle game that requires the constant precise movement of entire level graphics, as well as constant tracking of ballistic momentum, it's a good idea to keep the visuals as simplistic as possible, not only so that it's all readable, but also so it runs smoothly. The most obviously marketable and inviting way to utilize simplistic visuals in the age of increasing graphical fidelity then would have been to create Sanrio-esque adorable characters that would look complete even as simplistic 3D models. Monkey Ball is a complete aesthetic package. Sega went all out and got a brand deal with Dull, pushing the game hilariously into postmodern realms as it basically becomes the world's most elaborate banana advertisement. Even the control stick was shaped like a banana on the original arcade cabinet. Its late 90s electronic OST will delight us kids who grew up with soundtracks like Bomberman Hero, Ape Escape, or Tetrasphere, and could listen to soothing futuristic melodies over non-stop breakbeats all day forever. It's unfortunate that the game's constant countdown timer sound effect blares over the entire thing like a Legend of Zelda low hearts alarm, making it a hard game sometimes to be in the same room as, but when you're actually playing the game, you'll eventually have that sound hardwired into how you track your speed across stages, whose biggest challenge is often getting to the end before the timer runs out. I love how the main menu navigation operates like file indexing, so kids can easily navigate a huge number of customization options on different game modes without getting confused. It took me a long time to really start paying attention to the backgrounds of the stages, but once they start changing up on you, it's a gratifying way to track progress through an arcade run. Once I actually processed the gigantic Laputan flying castle in the background of the early stages, I started to wonder if there wasn't more of a narrative to these environments than first thought. With such a successfully realized aesthetic gimmick on their hands, Sega must have understood that even if they didn't market this game explicitly to kids and families, those audiences were going to be drawn to it, especially if it was going to be a launch title for the GameCube, already looked at as a more child-friendly console in the public eye, alongside a game about a haunted house and one about extreme sports. When you consider that the average child would probably get about 15 to 20 minutes of playable content out of arcade mode, it poses kind of a serious problem. I was already 10 when the GameCube came out, so I was more interested in games like Super Smash Bros. Melee and Pikmin, but I remember renting Super Monkey Ball as a game that my younger brothers and I could play together, getting basically nowhere in the arcade, and spending most of our week with it on party games. Judging Super Monkey Ball's 3 party games requires a degree of context. Monkey Race, Monkey Fight, and Monkey Target are all fun and mechanically interesting and have the ability to lure you into a long trance of repeated play, which is probably why their default lengths tend to take longer than a whole arcade run, but none of them are worth revisiting today for an adult gamer with a huge catalog of better similar games at their disposal, nor a kid seeking to play something on an emulator in 2018. But if this had been sincerely one of your first GameCube games, it would have been unique and interesting enough to take you off of replaying Mario Party and Pokemon Coliseum with your little brothers and your friends for a while if they weren't all old enough to be competent at Smash. I don't think there were such a wealth of great party games on the GameCube that Monkey Ball and its sequels wouldn't have been worth returning to throughout the console's lifespan, but really if you wanted to throw a party at the time and didn't like Mario, you might have been better off owning a PS2. Monkey Race stands at a fascinating, if underdeveloped, crossroads between Mario Kart and F-Zero. It's a high-speed racer like the latter with the items of the former, but unique in that there is no brake or acceleration. You simply control the ball with the stick, as if you were literally pushing it around. The only reason that it sort of controls like a racing game is because at a certain velocity, it's not so easy to change momentum. But the ways which courses toy with the game's physics and the speed at which you can slow down for a sharp turn are a nice twist on the speed racing formula. It's interesting to note that the team who developed this game would later end up co-producing F-Zero GX, so some of the seeds of how that game came out may very well have been sown in this minigame. Monkey Fight feels like it could have been repackaged with updated graphics and a few more complex stages to be sold on Steam during the recent boom of multiplayer bumper car equivalents. You've just got a big punching glove on a spring and you try to push everyone else off the ledge. Whoever has the most points at the end wins. The physics are zany and the power-ups are satisfying, so this one can easily stay fun for at least a handful of plays. If you go up against the computers, you'll quickly realize the importance of using Smash-esque directional input to keep yourself from flying after getting hit, and that's when you can find yourself getting surprisingly competitive over this one. Monkey Target has the opposite aesthetic, with the game's most laid-back music and finally silencing that goddamn timer. It's just your monkey against the open sky as you rocket yourself into the air and try to time the opening and closing of your ball in such a way as to safely glide onto a target in the ocean. There's sometimes traps, as determined by an overlong Wheel of Fortune animation, which slowly breaks you to abandon your impatience and simply be soothed by the calming blues of the sky and sea. It's a lot harder than it looks to do well, but it doesn't take long to start figuring out the basic concepts of how you could be doing better, even if actually landing the big points seems nearly impossible, kind of like the main game. Perhaps because this is the most unique party game, and the only one which doesn't penalize you for failing, but simply tallies up your score at the end, I remember having spent the most time with it as a kid. Those party games kept my family occupied through a 1-week rental, but let's say you actually owned this game and continued playing. Were the mini games actually worth the effort to unlock? If you were still planning to spend a whole lot more time with Monkey Ball and you didn't own any other games in these genres, then I could see someone getting into Monkey Billiards, Monkey Bowling, and Monkey Golf for a little while. But these are more trepidatious encounters than the party games, and stripped down enough to look cheap in a world with so many simulations of these sports already existing. Monkey Golf is almost neat in that the monkey just kinda clubs itself, but you can't even hit the ball up into the air, and the courses are unimaginative, so this mode gets boring fast. Similarly, Monkey Billiards is a little too slow and simplistic to be fun, with both players being asked to take turns pocketing each of the balls in numerical order. Monkey Bowling is at least pretty much just as engaging as any other bowling sim, with a fun easing in mechanic where you can correct really bad shot timing by putting different amounts of spin on the ball, but honestly, again, you'd really have to be starved for better games to have gotten so sick of the party games that you also spent a significant amount of time with the mini games. None of that really matters anymore though. What counts is that the game was sufficiently interesting for its time, no matter how old you were and what level of engagement you had with it. Be you a 6-year-old with only a couple of games carting out Monkey Target for the 20th afternoon, or an older arcade nut on his 200th try at 1cc'ing expert. Today there's still more than enough reason to give the game another glance if you're even slightly interested. It's the only place you'll find this mechanic, and if you can master the challenge, you will have pushed your understanding of it to the absolute extreme. Even if you just want to spend a couple of afternoons with it, it's also a tremendously entertaining 2-player co-op experience. With super short breaks between each player's turns thanks to its short levels, and trading between players after both wins and losses, along with such simple, intuitive controls that the skill floor is babies and the ceiling is ultra hardcore gamers, you won't struggle to find someone who'd be entertained by giving it a shot. There's a good handful of modes and options to shake up the experience in little ways, and you can even play certain multiplayer modes with a single controller, or trade one back and forth on a 1-player run for play points, so it's all around well suited to lengthy co-op sessions, all the better if you know someone who's nostalgic for it. Super Monkey Ball has an assload of sequels, including a direct one on the Gamecube, so we'll definitely be revisiting the series in my quest to discuss the entire console's library, but I'm giving the first game 15 out of 16 Gamecubes. While Super Monkey Ball could never be one of my personal favorites because it gets so difficult so quickly, and I'm not so deeply enamored with it as to throw myself against mastering its large number of uber hard levels, I nevertheless appreciate how it seems to offer an immensely satisfying experience to anyone who does. While on the one hand it might have been nice to have the ability to try more stages without having to unlock them in a linear order, and it sucks to fail out of arcade mode and have to start back from the beginning when you run out of lives, frankly, with as many as the game gives you and as hard as it gets, I can't see any way you'd be able to complete the later levels if you weren't good enough to clear the ones up to that point without dying 15 times anyways. And finally, overcoming the entire course in one go has got to be a massive pump, so I honestly don't want to blame the game in any way for the fact that I'm just not good or patient enough to get a lengthier experience with it. I still had fun just replaying the first half of the advanced courses over and over again, and it's obvious that the game didn't compromise anything in giving the best possible experience to those who were going to truly adore it, so I think it would be unfair to give it anything less than stellar marks as a well-realized execution of an excellent idea. If you're not familiar with it, Waverace Blue Storm might seem like a fairly innocuous game. Certainly not what comes to mind right away when you think about classic Nintendo launch titles. You might have been familiar with the franchise as a Nintendo fan in the late 90s, having encountered the well-liked Game Boy and Nintendo 64 titles, which of course were properly hyped in Nintendo Power magazine if nowhere else, but these more realistic sports series which didn't rely on a cast of recognizable Nintendo characters seemingly had the plug pulled on them when Nintendo realized that they could let the player just make their own personal avatar instead of choosing whichever forgettable regular named sportsman looked either cool or relatable enough to them, or just simply handled the way they liked. Personally, I have some affection for these games, having grown up with the excellent Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and 1080 snowboarding on the N64 from Neversoft and Nintendo respectively, and realized that sports games can be unexpectedly excellent when great developers come at them with their own unique brand of design expertise. It is in exactly this regard that Waverace is a noteworthy series, as the aesthetic and control scheme is significant significantly different enough from your boilerplate racing game that it can legitimately be said to offer a unique experience worthy of returning to even years later. Waverace Blue Storm has some of the most technical controls I've ever had to learn to play a racing game with even basic competence, to such an extent that I happily went to the tutorial after embarrassing myself on the first level and learned the importance of pressing the stick backwards in order to make razor-sharp turns. Once you get used to maneuvering the jet ski, you'll find yourself taking your eyes further away from it and onto the background, interpreting upcoming mega sharp turns far enough ahead of time to keep yourself on track. If you finish the tutorial and head over to free play to just ski around as fast as possible, do crazy tricks off of giant ramps, and pose a sexy girl on top of a jet ski, the game can be exhilarating and a lot of fun to just play, though the lack of music in this mode or any sense of urgency means that it gets old relatively quickly. I could see someone using this mode to just decompress or something as a comfy game, especially back at the time when it came out, but unfortunately Waverace doesn't have any single mode which achieves a satisfying balance of urgency and excitement with the freedom to just have fun. When I think about racing games, I usually think about me and a friend or two racing against however many computers in a 4-level circuit in games like Mario Kart or F-Zero, but Waverace doesn't have a mode like this. The only multiplayer mode is a disappointing one-on-one versus mode. In a racing game, it's most likely that whichever player has been playing the game longer and or developed better mastery over the controls is going to win every single time, which is likely to get boring or frustrating for one or both of the players. By inserting the computer characters, each player at least has a metric for how well they performed the stage in general, and can feel some satisfaction over not placing last even if they do lose to the other player. Even if one player is worse at the game, if neither is good enough to overcome the AI, then the worst player doesn't have to feel as bad about sucking. And if they're both better than the computer, then at least they can feel good about being good at the game. The only situation where a player is as likely to get bored and frustrated as they would competing one-on-one with one-sided results would be if they were consistently placing last while their friend was consistently placing first, in which case you should probably spend some time learning the game first. The only actual racing mode available in the game is an arcade-style competition mode, in which the player has to tally a certain number of points across a gauntlet of 4 levels, in any order of their choosing. I would consider these competitions to be the bulk of the game, since you have to beat them in order to unlock 3 of the game's merely 8 completely distinct courses, and you watch an ending sequence after you beat them. Because of the fact that in the competitions you are required to constantly pass these buoys on whichever side their arrow indicates, these races are punishingly difficult unless you've developed a complete grasp over the controls and memorized some of the more complex level layouts. It's not so much a matter of the AI opponents being all that good, especially if you keep your ears out for the sound effect of your turbo gauge filling up and use them on every possible straightaway. The problem instead is just how badly you can utterly fuck yourself if you make even a single mistake. Going off course, crashing your ski and flying off, accidentally overturning and heading backwards, or going over ramps wrong are common occurrences until you know the map like the back of your hand. But easily the most insidious traps in the game are its many long peninsulas. If you crash into a long stretch of land that takes a while to get around, you might as well kiss your entire career run goodbye. I've had plenty of races where I was taken from first to last place after a single slip up late into the race and been left without enough points to continue the campaign in an instant. I quickly developed a habit of playing what I considered to be the hardest levels first on every attempt, just to know whether my career was going to be over right away instead of later. Once I was good enough to conquer normal mode more than once, I realized that the game at its best is absolutely exhilarating. When you're actually competing for the lead, avoiding any mistakes, doing tricks off the ramps, and posing on the front of your jet ski as you cross the finish line, it's a hair-raising thrill ride. Thanks to the point system and the fact that you only need to place in the top 3 to win, being just on the margin of victory or even struggling to place 6 over last can be a meaningful and intense scenario, as you might still receive enough points to go on. Unlocking the Arctic Bay is a satisfying moment, as is the cutscene for completing story mode. But then you head up to hard mode and are greeted by the same 5 levels you just conquered. To be fair, most of them are significantly altered to the point of being almost entirely new courses with the same assets, but you'll still be once again running up the wall of a steep learning curve to master even more difficult versions of levels you already spent a ton of time in. So say you get tired of losing competition runs immediately by crashing into debris on new levels you're not used to, and you want to practice the levels elsewhere. This is going to lead you over to time attack mode, which is the only other place that you can play each level exactly as it appears in competition mode. It's a good way to learn the course and build yourself up to a point where you're not running into shit, but the default times that they set up for you to beat are so easy that the only reason to return to each stage would be to try and edge even more time off of your own run, or just to get comfortable enough with the stage to play competition. If you find yourself tired of having to dodge those damn arrows, the closest thing you'll find to an open course that encourages you to just have fun with the controls while maintaining some sense of urgency is stunt mode. Here the courses are reimagined to be ramp-centric and require less precise turning, and all you have to do is rack up as many points as possible while still making it to each checkpoint before running out of time. This would probably be one of the most entertaining game modes if not for the fact that you're once again in competition with yourself, so there's not much drive to keep doing it unless you're so damn enamored with the game that you'll just keep beating your own times as an excuse to play more. I find it kind of bizarre that Waverace Blue Storm doesn't contain any racing mode which allows you to play the courses in their regular forms without having to dodge the arrows, making every stage difficult to master at a high enough level to actually complete a whole competition run. Especially when the game locks what is comparatively a massive number of its stages behind the wall of beating the competition mode on 3 different difficulties. My best guess for why Nintendo went this route though is precisely because there were indeed so few stages, and that their focus was on the level of variety which those stages could present. At the time of the game's release, what critics mostly fixated on was the game's approach to water physics and dynamic weather conditions. Every time you play a competition, you're likely to have to do one or more stages in the rain or fog or with really tough waves, and in all stages you'll find that the water level subtly rises and lowers over the course of a race. Certain shortcuts and ramps will only be usable when they're at water level, and certain obstructions will only appear under certain circumstances. This dynamism is fascinating, but it also tends to encourage more low-risk play because of how difficult it can be to keep track of which shortcuts are currently available while also maintaining the already complex controls. In a sense, what I'm saying is that Waverace Blue Storm is the kind of game that becomes more fun the better you get at playing it. And while you could say that's true of most games, this is the type that can be legitimately enthralling at a high enough level of play, but can also be utterly infuriating at any level below that. When I talked about Super Monkey Ball, I praised the uncompromising way that it invited players to a monstrously difficult challenge, and I admire Waverace for also pushing players to the limit, but I think the game's approach to difficulty is significantly clumsier than Monkeyballs. In that game, if you died and had any lives left, you could try your hand at the exact same challenge in a matter of seconds. No level takes more than a minute, and even if you lose all your lives, you'll most likely blast your way back to the spot you were stuck at in no time flat, and you can easily go practice the exact same challenge in practice mode until you master it. In Waverace, you can be at the end of the 4th race of your championship run, hit a wall really hard, and then suffer the indignity of 15 seconds of getting back on course and madly trying to catch up with the crowd before it all goes out the window, and then you're back to practicing the course over and over again in time attack mode. Between getting to play 90 distinct short levels that you'd only lose out on if you were not good enough at certain screens to do them consistently, and 8 levels, which, while different depending on what mode and difficulty you're playing, can kill you out of a 15-minute campaign because you overturned one time on accident, I know which would make me rage quit faster. Let me not make out Waverace to be a bad game by any stretch though. My frustrations with it aside, there should be a point at which anyone who cares enough to power through more than a couple afternoons of mastering the courses could play the most complex course in the worst weather conditions, noodle through every obstacle perfectly, performing tricks off of every ramp and ski stands on every straightaway, hopelessly dusting the computer AI in the process, and maybe even competing for the global high score on a course as recognized in the speedrunning community. At this level of play, the game is almost certainly immeasurably satisfying, considering how excited I got just from being able to even perform a trick during a race at all. Aesthetically, the game is stroked with sparks of brilliance. Obviously, the water effects, while dated, are nonetheless gripping in how fervently water is animated and displaced. Even better than time attack practice, the best way I found to learn my way through the courses was to ride in the wake of my fellow racers and try to match their movements. This is another reason that I wish I didn't have to start a competition just to play alongside other racers. Most of the characters are pretty much forgettable, but the fact that they put one of them in booty shorts meant I got to fully appreciate just how detailed the animation on these models gets and trying to make it look like they're convincingly controlling the jet ski. Excellent work, Nintendo. One of my favorite things about the game full stop is the menus, which have this cool water rushing texture and the unselected options submerged underwater. All of the status screens and menus are likewise satisfying, but nothing beats the awesomely aesthetic loading screens. These always got me excited to play a level, and they even let you mess around with the water physics while you wait. I really miss the more aesthetically obsessed Nintendo of this era, creating stylistic visuals that continue to look great even after their technology has dated. The soundtrack is a lot of fun, sometimes abundantly cheesy, even when it's successful at creating a tense atmosphere with its overly straightforward attempts to seem badass, but other times legitimately captivating, as the guitars dip into some almost shoegazy sonic textures and sugary tones. It's a little too obvious that the guitar is the only real instrument being played on the soundtrack and that it was probably made by one guy, but at least that guy perfectly knew how to capture the unique aesthetic of high-speed jet ski stunt racing through dangerous-ass obstacle courses, somehow. There is exactly one narrative element to the game, and it is that each racer also has a named coach who radios advice to them as you play. Mostly it just amounts to praising you for passing arrows on the correct side and chastising you for doing so on the wrong one. Though the one thing I did appreciate is how they will inform you at the start of each race what place you need to come in order to move to the next round. It was the one thing that lent the competition a sense of narrative stakes as an event that is actually happening for our character. But while these coaches have more personality than the silent racers, there is no more to them than what serves the gameplay directly. That's maybe the weirdest thing about Waverace Blue Storm. I feel like this game stopped halfway between trying to be more grounded and sports game-esque than a typical Nintendo game, and going all out with the mayhem that arcade snowmobile and jet ski games usually generate their appeal with. I really don't think the kind of sports or racing fans who prize realism to any extent are going to be drawn to this brightly colored game full of Arctic killer whales, nor were extreme sports players, usually either focused on amassing the craziest chain combos possible on more freeform courses, or indulging the ever-increasing fixation the genre developed on mayhem simulation. It wants to gobble through your time with the intense difficulty of a tightly crafted arcade experience, but the wave effects end up being more impressive as a technical idea than as a gameplay enhancement when tracking their usefulness is so difficult, and the results are underwhelmingly tame for something that crosses the line way too far for fans of realistic sports to travel anyways. I give this game 12 out of 16 Gamecubes. At the end of the day, it's still a fun game when it's fun, and a thrilling one when you put some sweat and tears into it, and it's pleasant to look at and feels good to play, and that's all worth something if you decide to simply meet it on its own terms and accept what you get. As the third of the GameCube's only 3 Japanese launch titles, it's incredibly strange. The GameCube underperformed as a console overall in comparison to its rivals of the time or other generations of the company's consoles, especially on its Japanese launch, and it's not really hard to see why. Nintendo was banking on the overall construction quality of 3 games made relatively close to the chest instead of on mass market appeal. Every previous Nintendo console had launched with a Mario platformer, but this one launched with Luigi's Mansion, a game in a completely new and decidedly less player-driven or cathartic playstyle with much more of a niche appeal, because it was uniquely capable of showing off what the GameCube was uniquely capable of. If I had to say what that was, what Nintendo was trying to advertise with all 3 of these games, it's the precision of their controls. After a previous 3D console they designed with just a single joystick right before the Dualshock revolutionized the entire future of controller design, they wanted to promote the incredible precision afforded by their new joystick, and the addition of a second one. Ironically, for some reason they decided to make the second stick almost unusably terrible. As I talked about in the Luigi's Mansion video, both the game's controls and the shape of the C-stick were altered in service of one another throughout development, but somehow what this led to was a game that was given a new control style to minimize reliance on the C-stick, while gamers stayed far away from the GameCube when they wanted to play twin-stick shooters over the console generation. Isn't this the opposite of what should have come from the collaboration of the game and console designers on Luigi's Mansion? Nintendo has never been especially interested in what consensus has been drawn amid fans or developers about what is the best way to handle basically any part of game development. As a result, they fail at following trends and meeting existing consumer demand. The only way that they succeed as a company is when they manage to create something so appealing that it generates demand for itself, such as the NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Wii, DS, or Switch. When they make something that they can't convince anyone they want, they fail, like with the Virtual Boy, the Wii U, 3DS, Gamecube, and arguably even the N64, though some of these are only failures by the metric of being compared to other Nintendo consoles. When Nintendo launched the GameCube, the selling point was that it was a technical step up from the N64 with precise controls that led to new possibilities in how games could be made unique or difficult. But that wasn't really such a great sell to anyone who wasn't dedicated exclusively to buying Nintendo consoles. There had already been 2 excellent next-gen consoles before the GameCube came out, and while the Dreamcast was an even bigger failure, the PS2 launched with its Dualshock controllers way the hell earlier and already had Time Splitters, SSX, Rayman 2, Onimusha, Gauntlet Dark Legacy, Red Fraction, Dark Cloud, Twisted Metal Black, Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, and like 200 other games by the time the GameCube launched. Luigi's Mansion, Super Monkey Ball, and Waverace Blue Storm are all excellent games which prove what the GameCube is capable of, but they all have weirdly niche appeal to be the only 3 games on a console for the first month of its lifespan. Luigi's Mansion is obviously the most normal and was the highest selling, but you were likely either going to beat it in a couple of sittings or give up when you realized it wasn't really your kind of game. Super Monkey Ball was likely relegated to a party game unless you were seriously dedicated to the challenge, and Waverace doesn't even have the luxury of letting you throw a party with it before you're thrust into getting the hang of its complex controls. I can't say I'm surprised that the console was unsuccessful, but I'm also not surprised that it had a fervent cult following, and a library full of mine and many others' fondest memories of our lives as gamers. I would really like to continue covering the GameCube's library in as much depth as I have its 3 launch titles, just as I would also like to continue my series analyzing the Tales of franchise in depth. However, gaming videos are currently a side job for me, and I can't make any promises about my ability to always make time for them if there isn't any potential for it to eventually turn a profit or to grow fast enough that I always have reason to make time for it. If you want to see more videos diving into the history of niche titles, franchises, and consoles which haven't been covered in as much depth as other games have on YouTube, please help me to grow this channel by sharing my videos wherever you think people would appreciate seeing them, and subscribing to the channel to see more. I am Games, signing out.